I'd like to welcome you to our show, It's Not the Same Without the Sand. This is a series about raising the awareness about the erosion of our vulnerable coastlines. My name is Irene Davis, and I'm your host. I'm the president of the Trustees of Sandwich Beaches. And today is going to start a two-part series on the beach nourishment plan. And I'm very fortunate to have two guests here today. Kirk Bosma, who is a professional engineer from the Woods Hole Group. Kirk got his master's in coastal engineering from the University of Delaware. He is an expert in the areas of numerical modeling, coastal processes, sediment transport, and the impact of waves on coastal erosion. Kirk has worked on many projects that deal with erosion on the Cape and the islands. We also have here Bud Dunham, who is the Sandwich Town Manager. And Bud got his bachelor's in poli-sci from Wake Forest University, and then a master's of public administration from Syracuse University. Bud was the assistant manager from 1989 to 1993 and has been our town manager since 1993. So I want to welcome both of you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. So today we're going to start talking about the beach nourishment plan, and I want to just kind of discuss for the public to begin with what steps are involved in developing a beach nourishment plan. It's a big process, right? Maybe Kirk, you could start off.
Sure. Yeah, the beach nourishment plan and project in general is a huge undertaking for any coastal community. So there's the scope of work that we're currently engaged with the town with started almost a decade ago now.
Wow.
Looking at understanding the beach processes better, waves, sediment transport, tidal currents. Where's the sand going? Why isn't it coming into the town anymore? And some of those answers we obviously know already. There's a big macro influence of the Cape Cod Canal on the town of Sandwich. Both the canal itself when it was constructed and the structures, the jetties that are there, prohibit sediment from kind of naturally making its way down to the town of Sandwich. So there's a sediment-starved situation. There's a need here for sediment. A beach nourishment project and a plan, a beach management plan, if you will, consists of a lot of different factors. But a beach nourishment it's most important to understand that that's an engineered feature. I think a lot of people think sediment, when you just dump it on the beach, that might be a beach nourishment project. Not so much. I mean, these things are engineered just like you'd engineer a road or a building or a wastewater treatment plant, which is big on the Cape these days, obviously. There's engineering that goes into that. So understanding what the waves do, understanding what the best slope and grain size and orientation of the beach is. That's a piece of the plan or the project. Another big piece is the actual management of the beach. So there's the technical sediment placement, how is it going to perform, what it's going to do. And then there's also how is the human and natural resources influence going to interact with that. So signage, dog usage, ORV usage, the natural habitat function of the beach, how that's going to be managed by the town is another integral part of kind of the plan going forward.
Yeah, so I just want to ask you, Bud, how have you worked with Woods Hole Group? How did you engage them, and how are you working together with them on this plan?
Yeah, I think the relationship started probably at least about 15 years ago or so, just as different projects would come up involving the canal. And one of the primary ones I think that sort of kicked it off was the power plant owner at the time, Commonwealth Electric, had to do some extra dredging in the canal, and instead of dumping it offshore, we worked with Woods Hole Group to try to get the permits and the support in trying to get that onto the beaches. And that was really, at least since I've been here, the first sort of dune restoration beach renourishment project. And that, I don't remember the exact volume of sand, but that was pretty substantial. And if people remember, that's when beach grass was planted, mostly over what most people think of as Town Neck Beach, sort of heading west from the boardwalk, towards the entrance of the canal. And again, that was how we first started going. And then there was more work that we've done since then, and as Kirk had mentioned, really in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of effort to try to permit not only the beach nourishment project and plan, but also the Old Harbor Inlet project. And
so let me just step back to that first sort of dumping of sand on the beach. I remember that, and I remember seeing like just a couple of storms and it was gone. Now the sand where they planted the beach grass has really pretty much maintained, but lots of people are asking the question, why are we dumping money into this project when they put all that sand on the beach and within a season it was gone? I don't know, Kirk, maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really legitimate question. You know, one of the things you always think about with beach nourishment is, well, we just put the sand on the beach and it disappears, right? So, you know, there's a reality to that. I think it's important to know there was actually 2 nourishment projects, one back in 1990, which is the one Bud was talking about, which was kind of the reestablishment of the dune. That was with the beach grass planting. The boardwalk went over that. That has performed very well. That was put in kind of an area where the dune would normally want to be, right? So that's been functioning and performing. The subsequent nourishment was in around 2000 with additional Cape Cod Canal material. That was placed out in front of the dune.
Yep.
It was a situation where the canal was going to take the sediment offshore unless the town quickly stepped up and did something to get it on the beach, and that was permit-wise. The canal actually paid for that whole thing, but it wasn't a designed placement. Okay, it was just, let's dump the sand there, and that harkens back to what I was saying earlier, which is, you know, these have to be engineered things. If they're not, they're just going to do exactly what happened, which is erode in a couple storms. So that nourishment you're referring to wasn't really designed. It was just a dumped placement of sand in an area that it really wasn't going to last. It wasn't a beach nourishment project. It was just a sand placement, and it was just better to get that sand in the system versus taking it offshore and dumping it for no purpose. So, you know, the key thing is, you know, how is a beach nourishment going to function? How is it going to perform? You know, I would say if it was all bad, right, other states in the U.S. wouldn't be doing it. Florida does it all the time. New Jersey does it all the time. Delaware does it all the time. These things work and they perform well. Just important to understand that you have to engineer it, and then 2, it has a service life. So just like, you know, you need to repair something in your home on a certain time schedule, like your shingles.
Right.
They only last so long. Beach nourishment, similar, has a design life. The public perception is, though, and the misunderstanding is what that design life is. And if you understand that it's much shorter, and that it, you know, is a 10 to 15 type year design life before you have to start thinking about doing something again, you know, the public education of that is important. Is it valuable? It costs a lot, but it's still economically, once you get to that 10 or 15 year time window, the damages you save from shore protection, the economic recreational values that you bring in, it's been proven that that economically makes sense. So as long as you have a sediment, as long as it's engineered correctly, it can be a very beneficial thing. That project you were talking about just wasn't engineered. So it was sediment put in the system, and that isn't a beach nourishment. No one should judge that as a beach nourishment project.
Right. There's a lot of misperceptions, I think, about that, and part of talking about this today is really to try to help educate the public about why that really wasn't ever expected to last, because I think a lot of people don't understand that. So in terms of a big picture, and maybe Bud, you can start with this.
Sure.
I know that we've had this issue when I was a kid. I remember the water coming through at the inlet between the 2 jetties, and now that's changed, and that has sort of drifted, and we are getting a lot more volume into the creek. I think, and maybe you can speak to this too, that this might help to explain why we're getting these huge, really high flood tides. We're getting the boardwalk covered almost monthly now, or at least to the boardwalk with these flood tides. So obviously we've got to take care of that. So we've got that issue and the beach nourishment. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I would say, again, just from the bigger picture, from a higher level, obviously, as Kirk had mentioned, the biggest cause of it was the construction of the Cape Cod Canal, and especially the East End jetty that went out quite a ways. And so a lot of the sand that would normally be working through the system, making it to Sandwich Beach, is trapped on the other side of the canal. So that's a big issue. And I think it's fair to say, if you look at maybe parts a little bit east of us that aren't as impacted by the jetty, you know, Sandy Neck, I think anyone would say, although it's not always sandy, but Sandy Neck, you know, is certainly in better condition. and has not experienced the erosion that we have because there's more sand in the system that naturally works its way down. So I think that's probably the biggest contributor of the problem, and I think one of the spin-off effects, because we've been so starved for sand, mostly in the Town Neck area, from Spring Hill Beach, which is just east of the Old Harbor entrance to the mouth of the canal, is because of the jetties. But then, as you had mentioned, with the Old Harbor entrance, which is the body of water that eventually goes underneath the boardwalk, over time, the mouth of that has migrated and also widened. So I think you're correct in that more and more water comes through naturally compared to how it used to happen several decades ago. And I think it's also fair to say, based on the work that we had done, which I think more or less culminated in a draft environmental impact report that we submitted to the state in late 2005 and was talked about with them through 2006 and beyond. We had tried to design a solution to the Old Harbor Inlet because that is also contributing to some of the erosion that people see, not to the extent that the jetty does. So I think just from what people witness with their own non-technical eyes like my own, you can tell that there's more water coming in, and the new moon tides have a lot. Like you said, there's more water underneath the boardwalk than there used to be even 5-10 years ago. I think it's also important to point out that through the years the town has tried to take steps with the Army Corps of Engineers by filing different requests with them to sort of step up to the plate and accept responsibility for what's happened there. And there's several different fronts. Many of the sections of the federal law that we applied under, the numbers have changed over time, but our two primary requests are still valid. And the most important of those is still what's called the Section 111 request. And that would be if the Corps does the proper cost-benefit analysis and determines that they, in fact, are causing the problem. That's extremely important because then they accept responsibility, until they decide not, undo that study. And they're responsible for 100% of the cost to rectify what they've caused.
Can I ask a question about that? So when they put the jetty in, did the Army Corps of Engineers own the canal at that point?
I believe so, and I know they've extended it over time as well.
And did they do you know if they've extended? There was a recent editorial in the Sandwich Enterprise kind of questioning when this extension was done and what was done. I've heard there was extensions out. I've also heard, certainly it looks like there's different color granite, or rock on one part of the jetty. Was it extended up? Was it widened? I'm just wondering if either of you know anything about what that was done.
Yeah, there's a detailed time history of the canal.
Yes.
The construction, the structures that go with it, the jetties. There was actually lengthening of the structures, heightening of the structures, and then something called sand tightening,
yes,
which eventually means
kind
putting more rocks, locking them in closer. In the environmental impact report that was filed, there's a pretty detailed timeline of everything that was done at the
public?
canal. That is a public document, yeah. So, to harken back to your previous question, in terms of the higher tides in Old Harbor, the town, to their credit, recognized this good 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. The breach at Old Harbor Inlet that happened at the no-name storm in the 1990-91 time frame, that project was what was a key part of pushing that forward, and that was looking at reestablishing that entrance, providing nourishment on both sides to kind of stabilize it, and then hopefully reducing some of that potential flooding occurrences in the Sandwich Harbor system. Of course, you have to also remember the Barrier Beach is eroding at the same time, so that's a problem that you have there as well. So that project started 10 years ago, ran into some difficulty permitting-wise. But yeah, all that is kind of caused or kicked off by the Cape Cod Canal construction, which happened around 1909 time frame. So.
Now, you've mentioned before that we've got this Barrier Beach, and again, when I grew up back in the 60s, I remember those dunes being very high. I used to jump off them like most other kids did, and really wide. I actually just recently saw an aerial view. I don't know the date, but it was obviously a while ago. Very wide. You talk about the Barrier Beach sort of moving inland, but isn't there going to be a point where those dunes get so flat, because they're so flat now, that there's not really going to be I understand the sand is migrating that way, but is there going to come a point where we really don't have a Barrier Beach? It's just going to be flat?
Hey, potentially could have been there already. I mean, without that 1990 dune nourishment project, which established a pretty stable system there.
But that wasn't in the barrier part, right? That's behind the parking lot.
That was, well, yeah, in front of the parking lot, depending on your viewpoint, I suppose. But a barrier beach, the way it migrates, is always going to roll over itself and move landward. However, in this case, it's kind of anthropogenically influenced a lot by the canal, so you don't have the sediment source coming in.
Right.
So sand would get rolled over, would also move along shore. You don't have any sand coming in. So you have some of the rolling over going, but you have a lot of it heading down to the west towards Sandy Neck.
Right.
So there's, again, this sediment deficit. So yeah, eventually in time, you're going to, there's that sediment, equation that doesn't add up. You have more going out than you have coming in. So I mean, it doesn't take me to tell you that that's going to be an issue eventually. Right.
In terms of, and I know that you're in the process of developing sort of the plan, the engineering plan for the nourishment and the realignment. Do you anticipate that it's going to include increasing the size of the dunes again? I know you've built dunes in Martha's Vineyard and it's been successful, and they've built dunes in West Ennis Beach, built a big dune. Are we planning on building those dunes back up so we have that extra protection, not just putting sand on the beach?
Yeah, ideally, you'd want to have a two-prong engineering design, which is dune reestablishment and then a beach berm or beach width increase. We just successfully completed one of those over, I mentioned the Martha's Vineyard project that happened in phases with a dune reconstruction and then a beach nourishment. And when done together, they function very well. The beach nourishment is kind of the first line of defense and the dune is the second line of defense. What we're doing here for the town is a number of different things. We want to continue to push the Old Harbor project. I mentioned that briefly, but that's the one that's been designed, submitted an environmental impact report, has some initial permitting work done for it, and ran into some snags with certain environmental issues. But we're also now expanding that to a more broad beach nourishment engineering design and program. I think it's critical for the town to push that beach width out. It's a big part of what a beach nourishment is. The town has never had that. They've been doing dune reestablishments, but we really, really need to get the beach width out there, put sand back into the system, give people a place to put their blankets, but more importantly, from my standpoint, provide storm damage protection. So if you just have the sand at the dune, that's kind of the last line of defense. So you need to get the waves further away, provide that dissipation of energy before it gets to the dunes. If it's allowable, we'd also like to fortify the dunes. That brings in some environmental questions again, though, because that's habitat area for certain types of species. They use those breaches, those lower overwash areas. So again, it's a balancing act of management there. But pushing that beach width out, I think, is key, and I think people will be surprised at how much different that performs. On the Vineyard, we had the dune project in first. It went through one winter, got hit, kind of eroded a little bit, scarped, kind of similar to what you'd see at Sandwich when the boardwalk kind of falls down. But then the beach nourishment went out in front of that, pushing the beach width out 100 feet. Made a substantial difference in the performance of the system, how people view it, what the perception of it was. And that's something that's never been done on Sandwich that really needs to happen. And that's what this project is really more focused at doing. Even
if we have the breaches already in the dunes, I mean, I understand widening the beach is really important and raising it. But I think, Paul Schrader, who's been sort of really documenting this well, he's actually counted 5 of those breaches now. So, even if we widen and make that sand higher, you think that we're going to be okay? And we don't need to somehow close those breaches up?
Well, again, ideally, you want to do that. And if you had your way, if I had my way, of course we would fill those in and nourish it, because it's going to make for a more engineered, stable, long-term solution. The reality of that, I don't know. I think it's going to be easier to get a beach berm width that's pushed out than try to fill those breachways. The key thing is maybe that by pushing the water out further with a beach width, maybe you get some natural recovery of those breachways, right? Right now, the reason they're all forming is the waves are going to come in, there's no beach, it's going to overwash right through the dunes, get back into the Old Harbor Inlet in the marsh system. But imagine a buffer, if you will, before that. Maybe, you know, wind-blown sediment, the sand starts to recover a little bit in those systems because the storms can't instantaneously get there every time.
Right.
And I think it's important to point out too, as Kirk was mentioning, the dune work that we have done twice, especially the second one that people might remember better because it was only about 10 years ago. Again, because that went above mean high water, it sloped steeply to the water, but then when the waves break against it, it's not that the sand leaves the system, it just goes down and then goes probably underneath the water. But if we properly designed it so it was more gradual out, you know, into the water, I think that's what we really need to do for the beach nourishment project. And then it's almost two separate things, and yet they're inexorably tied together.
Yes.
But there's the, you know, combined with that is the inlet stabilization project that we've talked about. And I think we know already at this point that that's the harder project to permit, and we're still going to try to do both. But it may very well be that we're going to have to, you know, decide at some point, do we try to get the permits on one faster than the other and then not give up or stop working on the second one. But so that will be interesting just to see how it all plays out. And I think it's important to note over time that, you know, we've gotten a lot of widespread support for what we've tried to do. The local canal office of the Army Corps has been extremely supportive through the years. Obviously the power plant, the last two nourishment projects, the town of Sandwich has not put a penny into, other than, you know, the design and permitting. They've done most of the work and the expense. And then even the Concord office of the Army Corps of Engineers for the New England region has been generally supportive of what we've been trying to do. But again, those are more the smaller projects. I think what we've touched on as well, sort of that bigger issue is the Section 111 study, which might involve more than just the Concord office. And so that's where we need to call on, you know, some of our elected delegation, especially at the federal level, to try to help out. But I guess mostly what I wanted to point out is that there really is a two-pronged approach. We want to do both at the same time. But, you know, if we find out we're getting, you know, too much, running into too many walls on one, we'll have to focus on the other first. So
the Section 111, just for the audience here listening, is a study that's done, and if it's deemed that the Army Corps is responsible, and it does seem like it's worth, you know, the replenishment, that they actually pay for 100% of that. I think that's a really important point to bring up, because I think people are thinking, where's this money going to come from? And we're actually going to have a show on that particular topic about what the financial sort of potential sources of funding would be. But that, I think, is a really important issue. If we are able to be successful with the Section 111 study, that really helps the town significantly. So my question to you, Bud, is how can we, as the lay public, how can we as the trustees of Sandwich Beaches, how can the people watching today, how can they help with this? Right. We've got an election year. This is a great year to maybe, you know, get some kind of support going for this particular issue.
I'd say, you know, first of all, I guess have faith in the people that are trying to push the right buttons to get it done. Yep. That would be one thing. And just to back up a couple of things that have happened, you know, really within less than a year. You know, we had a special meeting where we had a number of the state and a couple federal officials there late last summer, where we tried to educate them on what had been done so far and what we've done over really the last 10 to 15 years, and then where things sat at the federal level. And so an individual who works in Representative Keating's office has been assigned to sort of help us with that, and so she's been very helpful in trying to push things at that level. Within the last 2 months, the chairman and vice chairman of the selectmen, we happened to find out that Senator Scott Brown was doing some fundraising in Hyannis, and so we were able to actually get a one-on-one meeting with him, you know, literally the three of us and Senator Brown in a room to talk about some of these issues, and that was the only issue we talked about. We didn't bring up anything else. We just tried to focus on what they could do to support. So I think the advice we've gotten back from them is sort of let them continue to work through the proper channels and try to, you know, bring it up on the priority list of the people who are doing those studies. But if we find out that that's not getting anywhere, that's when I think we really have to ride herd on them, to ride herd on the people, you know, from the Army Corps who do the actual technical analysis to see if this can get approved. Because, you know, I think in the long run, we've all felt that's the primary thing we need to get, in addition to the permits that we've talked about. But that Section 111 study is really huge. And if that doesn't get, funded, then I think we're going to have some stark realities to face in terms of, what's ahead, not only permitting wise, but financially to try to address that problem.
There was a group in Barnstable who they had to rebuild their bulkhead at Barnstable Harbor. And of course it was during the time when they had shovel-ready money. It was a very different time a few years back. But they started a huge letter writing campaign. And they felt that that was very successful in terms of trying to get the support for the financial, backing for this particular project. So I'm just wondering if there'll be a time when we need to kind of just get the grassroots efforts out there and try to really bring this higher up on people's priority lists.
Yeah, I agree. I think there will be that. That time will come, and it's probably not too far away. I think another important thing to remember, since we submitted that draft EIR report in the mid-2000s, after Hurricane Katrina hit in New Orleans, we literally got letters back from the Corps saying that any review of any project that we have in this region has now ceased. All of our resources are now focused on that for obvious reasons. But I think everything came to a standstill and a halt for quite a while with the Army Corps because so much energy and funding had to be focused on that area. And so it just so happened, time-wise, that wasn't good for us in the sense of how our requests were being reviewed. And, obviously when you factor it in compared to something that happened there, it's, ours is not a big issue. So,
right.
But it's big to us. So it's something we just need to continue to push.
And I would add, I would encourage people to contact their senators and representatives and say, hey, this is an issue of concern to us. Because heightened awareness at the upper levels of government would then help convey to the Army Corps that this is a serious issue. The Section 111 authority, if authorized, basically would authorize the Corps to mitigate for damages that they cause through one of their federally authorized projects, which the canal and its associated structures is a federally maintained project. So if that has undue influence or negative influence on property, they have to 100% mitigate for that problem that occurred. So.
And it's pretty clear from me looking at some of the houses that are along Town Neck Beach that there are properties that are at very, very high risk of going into the water. They're only a few feet from the edge, and I think that it is important for people to raise that level of awareness. I think sometimes people don't really know that that's happening.
Yeah, it's funny how people, I often say to my compatriots down Cape that, anytime there's a big storm, all the Boston news stations immediately go to Chatham and start filming all their storm coverage from there.
Right.
And yet, after Hurricane Bob and the no-name nor'easter that followed a couple months later, we lost more homes in Sandwich on Spring Hill Beach than Chatham did. And yet, that doesn't get, for whatever reason, it doesn't resonate in some people's minds. So I think, it's sort of not only the issues that we've talked about protecting, but also when Mother Nature decides to act up to a certain extent, there's only so much you can do, but hopefully you've put things in place to help mitigate that as best you can.
And it's not just the homes on Town Neck and Spring Hill. It's
businesses.
The businesses, the infrastructures that are, may seem like a far away.
Oh yeah, no.
But up in the marsh system, if that gets inundated with flooding, you're going to have flooding right in town.
That's right. Our historic town.
Yeah, and there's, just the recreational value of the beach as well. And if it goes away, it's a problem.
Right.
So it goes beyond just, the homes on the beach, which I think a lot of times people just think, well, it's the home on a beach.
Yeah.
It's a town concern,
and it is, and even the people in Forestdale and South Sandwich, if that town gets flooded, we're all affected. I think that's something that's really important. I think a lot of people think, well, you bought on the beach, that's your responsibility, and it's really not my problem, but it is our entire town's problem. I think we're going to have to finish with that. So I want to thank you both for being on, and thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.